All right. Hello and welcome to the Doubt Society podcast. I am your host, Riley Morgan, and today I will be talking to Eric Van Evans. Eric is a writer and a YouTube content creator. He speaks and writes about Christianity, theology, philosophy of religion, psychology, politics, and more. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so you are the brave one that has been the first believer
Uh-oh.
to be a guest on the podcast that's called Doubt Society.
Yeah,
So hopefully you take that as an honor.
that's courageous of me. Yeah, you have to give me credit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think let's see. I think we met through James, if who's was the first guest on this podcast.
I
Is
believe
that correct?
so. Yeah, I
I
think
think he
so.
was who intertwined us on the web. Um, and I don't know if it was. I can't remember where I first ran into David Bentley Hart, but I had was reading him at the time. I think that I saw your page and saw you knew who he was,
Yeah.
and he's not really I wouldn't say he's obscure, but he's not the most popular author on the planet, right?
He's definitely not. No, he is.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say obscure. You're right about that. But um, yeah, his I think his work is quite difficult to read at times. He certainly uses a lot of big words, jawbreakers.
Oh yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
he is a little obscure.
Yeah.
Definitely
You
not
could
like a
definitely
William Lane Craig,
right.
those guys. So
Yeah, yeah, you could definitely label him as verbose.
yeah, yeah,
But yeah, so
true.
I've been reading his book, and I think that was my first interest, and I thought, well, if this guy likes David Bentley Hart, he's more than likely a great prospect for the show.
Yeah,
So before we dive in and talk about
sure.
David and his works a little bit, kind of the first thing I wanted to do is I like to try to introduce each of the guests that come on the show. Um, so, and I don't actually know this yet, but I thought we'd talk a little bit about your faith journey or your intellectual journey, and whether you were brought up in the church or you became a believer later in life, or how that kind of looked. So, walk us through that if you would.
Yeah, for sure. So I would say my family and I really grew up in not an atheistic household, not agnostic, theist, Christian, Catholic, any of that. It was really never talked about. We were largely just disinterested in it. I remember going to church when I was younger, a handful of times, but it was more so to impress my grandmother, who was a devout Catholic. So my parents just kind of said, just go to church. It's a good thing to do. Um, but I certainly was never religious or raised in a religious household at all. Just wasn't talked about. And I would say that persisted for quite a while up until maybe around 15 or 16. I started to really become interested in these profound existential questions. Why am I
Eric,
here?
can you pull that mic
Yeah,
up just a bit?
for sure.
Sorry, yeah, just
It's okay.
I think our levels are just a little low. You're
Yeah,
coming in
absolutely.
like 20%.
Can you hear me
There we
now?
go.
Is it good?
Yeah, maybe just a little bit closer,
Sure.
but we're pretty. I'm just
How,
looking at the levels, and
yeah. How
it's
about
just
now?
bouncing a little low. I think that should be good.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, wait, where was I?
You had visited church for grandma, but never was really religious
Yeah, I was
per
never
se.
really religious up until, well, I still wasn't at 16, 17, but that's the age where these existential questions start to come about. Why do I exist? Um, is there a God? What does it mean to be good? Just baffled by why we're here. Why does anything exist at all? Like live in its nest. Um, so I think shortly after that phase, I would say around 18 years old, I was introduced to the new atheists, right? So Hitchens, Dawkins, Harris, Dennett. Although I really never read Hitchens or Dennett, it was more Dawkins and Harris. And I was pretty convinced by a lot of their points. I thought their points were really strong. Certainly the rhetorical strategies that they had, um, their polemics were pretty intense. They were witty, Harris holds a PhD in neuroscience. Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist. So I said, hey, I really trust these guys. This has to be true. Christianity's stupid. It's just, so who could believe this? Who could believe that God exists? With Harris talking about, belief in God being an imaginary friend, or Dawkins asserting that, it's the flying spaghetti monster.
Or the tooth fairy.
Or the tooth fairy, right. And,
Right.
So I just became pretty convinced by this and said, there's just no point in even entertaining that at all. It wasn't until around 20 when I discovered people like Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Soren Kierkegaard, some contemporaries like Alvin Plantinga, David Bentley Hart, Edward Feser, William Lane Craig, and Ed Feser too. Did I mention Feser? I don't think I said
Yeah.
Feser. Yeah, Feser. Okay.
You did.
Then at that point, I started to say, wow, actually really smart people believe this. And the more I kept reading about it and talking with others about it, I became convinced that this is probably true. Certainly that God exists. I think it's inductively much stronger that God exists than God not existing. We can't forget, ultimately, what we're doing is trying to posit the best explanation for all of reality, right? And at the end of the day, the proposition, does God exist, is either true or false. It's true or false. And I think the evidence entails theism. And from there, I just became really immersed in it. And I do consider myself a theist. And from there, kind of went on to Christianity. So in a nutshell, that's pretty much my journey.
Sure. So
Yeah.
where did you end up, or when you become a theist, what tradition do you sort of like align yourself with a certain tradition now?
In terms of
At all?
theism?
Yeah. So are you consider yourself a Christian?
Yeah,
I
but certainly
assume.
classical theism.
Classical theism. Okay. So
Yeah.
do you attend a church? Do you align more with Catholicism or with Eastern religion or
I
Eastern?
would say I'm non-denominational,
Sure.
although I do have an affinity for the East, Eastern Christianity. But yeah, non-denominational. I really became a Christian just 6 months ago, so
Oh
this is
wow.
very fresh. So I don't really. I've been to church a couple times in the past 6 months, but I'm not really even a part of a church right now. Yeah.
Okay. So
So
that was a
it's
quick turn. I don't think I knew that.
yeah. So it's
That it was
relatively
so
yeah.
recent.
It's
So
been
how old are you now?
25.
25.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So it was years
Um,
of really doubting, and I still have profound doubts, of course, which is normal, right? If you don't have doubts, something's wrong. You have to have doubts within anything you believe. You shouldn't really be satisfied with your convictions at all, right? You should always have doubts, right?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I think that's probably one of the things with dogmatic faith, at least.
for sure.
That beliefs tend to be held like this, which for those who can't see me, I'm just clenching my fists, right? They tend to be held just not only extremely tightly, but they become a part of one's identity. And it's it can be very difficult to A, adjust them, but B, God forbid you have to change one
Oh,
of them, or
absolutely.
and
And
also yeah. So when you say you became a Christian, did you have a conversion experience? Like were
I
you baptized? Did you have a conversation with someone? What was the kind of walk us through that, if you would?
yeah, I was baptized when I was really like young, like a baby. But it wasn't really. I wouldn't really say it was. I didn't have any kind of religious experience, so to speak. I just really started to look at the character of Christ and became just immersed in it. I thought, his teachings are very profound. I think there's good evidence that he existed. Um, the resurrection. Even if the resurrection did not really happen, of course, that would be a defeater for Christianity, but it still serves its purpose in terms of uh, you know, psychology. You could think of it as like an archetype in terms of, hey, we need to resurrect anew every day. We need to, there needs to be a death. We need to shed our old skin and become anew, become gods, right? So even if the resurrection didn't really happen, I still think Christianity is a pretty profound, um, paradigm in terms of its understanding of human nature. So it just attracts me in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, Christianity does have that. It has the dying and rising, motif, which they feel it is in other places, but
For sure.
it's quite unique, I think, in many ways in the Christian tradition, and it's most profound, I think, as well. And then you have not only the death and resurrection, but also the idea of incarnation, which is kind of in a way this glorification of man, in a way. And I was reading yesterday someone, I'm not sure if I agree with the statement, but that was the beginning of human rights. I don't know how much I believe with that, but the idea that God is man, and then with the falling of the Spirit, that God then indwells human beings. And then you have Paul, of course, there's no slave, no master.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at
no man, no woman.
Yeah, if you look at pre-Christian cultures, there wasn't a particular onus on this universal egalitarianism. Like, we all are one under God. We all have these rights that must not be violated. We're image bearers of God. We're special. We have dignity. There's a really good book by Tom Holland. It's called Dominion, and this is basically the topic of the book. Studying how the world was before the coming of Christ. So I would really recommend you check that out, as well as your followers, for a more detailed explanation on that point.
Yeah. So when you say, I like what you said about the archetype. I've found with some liberal Christians, people that still, use they identify with the name Christian, but they would classify themselves in a more liberal sense. They may not believe in a literal resurrection, but they still believe in the story, and they believe in the idea of it, and they think the spirit, so to speak, of Christianity is really enough for them to identify with it and live their life as a Christian, because it resonates so much with them, these sort of themes and these ideas. But you said you believe in a literal, and you think that's essential to the Christian faith.
I mean, I think it is essential. Even what Paul says, if Christ didn't rise, your faith is in vain. It's false.
Yeah.
If it wasn't actually a historical event that occurred, it is false. I mean, if they found a tomb and it said Jesus Christ and his bones were in there and it was identified to be him, then what are we to say? He didn't really rise. Yeah. It was just fictitious.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I do not. I understand the liberals who adhere to that sort of thing and use Christianity more as like a guiding ideal or guiding principle for life. I understand that, but to me, it really is only worthwhile, at least in immersing yourself with it and identifying with it and living a life as a Christian, if something actually happened. That's my personal opinion, and it was my personal opinion when I was a Christian.
Okay.
And it still is now. One of my, because I didn't immediately go from devout believer to raging heathen. There was some, there was an intermediary.
Be a good Instagram
there.
name or YouTube channel, raging heathen. Nice.
Yeah, if I was angrier, it might work. But I spent a little bit of time in liberal Christianity, and to me, though, I have a harder time. Well, it's kind of both ways. I have a hard time respecting it. In some ways, I respect it more. In some ways, I respect it less. I respect it less because I think it just becomes this sort of pick and choose what you want and leave everything else out. And I was a fundamentalist more for the most part, and so I know that's part of just my casting about how I was brought up to understand it. But also, to a degree, it's kind of I still think it's a legitimate point. So when I say like pick and choose from the bits, and I mean like people believe in a literal resurrection, but they don't believe that maybe the God of the Old Testament did all the things that are recorded there.
Sure. That's something my brother actually says a lot. My brother Kyle, he's really interested in philosophy, theology, and he mentions that point a lot. In fact, he says that exact same thing. We pick and choose. And that's an interesting point, But if you want to expand more on that, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. So I guess, and we can start talking about, I guess, Hart a little bit here as well,
Sure.
Since he's kind of the point that brought us together. when I started reading That All Shall Be Saved, folks, we referenced this earlier. This was his, I believe, most recent book, and is the best case I have come across for universalism. So universalism, for those who don't know that term, that's the idea that in the end all things will be restored to God. All people will be saved, and the universe as a whole will kind of be pulled out of this fallen nature, you could say, and restored back to an Edenic sort of state. And I was first introduced to this idea actually by, here we go, I'm gonna drop a name here, Rob Bell. So all the serious Christians are clenching their heart and gasping for air right now.
Yeah.
Because he's widely recognized as a heretic. I was first introduced to the idea from him in his book Love Wins, I think in 2013. And it had a great impression on me. It wasn't enough to keep me as a believer, but I thought that was a much more cohesive, respectable, and beautiful view of the faith than otherwise. But kind of bringing this back to what I said about the bits and pieces.
Sure.
I have a hard time seeing it in Scripture. I kind of respected Hart's what he did with that, and maybe it has more to do with translation, and I should get back into studying my Greek. But the sentiment of it and the idea of it, I greatly appreciate it. So, are you a believer in an actual hell, or you kind of identify with Hart that there is no hell, or what's kind of walk me through your thoughts there?
That's a good question. I do identify with Hart. I think that there is a place such as hell, or an experience. I don't think we can fully understand the ontology of hell. I think we can understand the psychology of hell very greatly, and I think a lot of us have found ourselves in that. Whether we're, immersed in sin, just be envious, greedy, cheating on our partner, just doing all of these horrible things that contribute to a hell. We build a hell, right? And sometimes we walk in heaven. We find moments where we are doing the right thing, right? But other times we are just immersed in sin, and slowly over time you might not notice it, but it builds gradually and gradually and gradually, and you find yourself in that hell. And so I don't think it's really I don't think we should look at hell as the ontology. We shouldn't focus on the ontology, because we don't know what that would be like. If there really is such a place as hell, how would we know what that would be like, right? The only correct way to talk about it would be the psychology of hell, kind of like C.S. Lewis talks about, and many others. So I think that's the most important way to speak about hell: psychology, not ontology.
Yeah. I think that the Christian, or the fundamentalist Christian counter to that would be, well, we find out about hell in Scripture. Like we pull from hell in Scripture, the gnashing of teeth and the separation from God and all these sorts of ideas. And they're going to start referencing, the few pieces of the few verses that reference Gehenna, which is, what the Greek word for what we translate to hell. Or there's also a mention of Hades, and I think one mention of Tartarus as well. Somewhere in the epistles. I can't remember exactly what it is. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I would just, my reply to that would be that the Bible seems pretty ambiguous on the notion of hell. I mean, as Hart elucidates throughout his entire book, he gives many, many verses that seem to suggest that there is a universal reconciliation with all rational creation. Like you said in the beginning, all creation will be restored in God, right? So I would just argue that they're not looking at the Bible in the right fashion, right? Sure. I mean, even the original Greek and whatnot, you can't just, you really have to investigate this, right? And from my studies of people like Hart, it seems pretty ambiguous. It does not seem absolutely clear that everyone goes to hell for eternity. So that would be my reply to the fundamentalists.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, the funny thing about fundamentalist is, well, first of all, it's fairly new, technically speaking, in terms of how long it's been around, at least that specific type of fundamentalist. And the goal was to return us to kind of what the early Christians believed that was supposed to be, the goal. But if you read some of the early Christians, people that Hart references, like there's some of the early church fathers or the Cappadocian fathers or these other people, Gregory of Nyssa, Origen, you start getting a picture of hell that doesn't look like what people think. The fundamentalists had this idea that if they could just drop in to the day of Pentecost, that everything would look, everything would be uniform because Jesus had just been there and he had just told everyone what to believe. And sure, you had the squabbles that Paul was trying to sort out with these letters everywhere, but it would be, just this beautiful, symbiotic sort of everything's woven together tightly, and this is what we believe. Whereas, in fact, if you actually read the New Testament, you have disagreements within the New Testament that Hart points out. You have a wide, ever-growing array of disagreements once you get out of the New Testament and start reading, anything that's non-canonical or the early church fathers, the patristic fathers. And, that's why Bart Ehrman would say he doesn't speak about early Christianity. He speaks about early Christianities. It's plural.
That's interesting.
And I think that's a wonderful point because, there were so many competing views, and one does not have to be a fundamentalist to be a Christian. And so I thought so for me, when I began having my own doubts, it began for me with hell.
Right.
Not because I hadn't thought about hell or I didn't know what hell was. I was raised not only going to church multiple times a week, but doing my own Bible studies and being quite serious about it my whole life. It was just, I think part of it was when you actually go to put your life to stand upon something that is going to be the foundation of your life. So like I said before we started recording, I was on track to be a pastor. That's what I was at school for. Then I think you are able to look at your beliefs in a new light that you couldn't have in the past because you're really stepping out and acting on those things. And for me, hell was one of the first pillars to go that really made me start doubting the veracity of faith. And I played around with ideas like annihilationism or universalism. Like I read Edward Fudge, I have sitting over here, and I read some Bell. And to me, though, I never found anyone in the liberal Christianity phase at that point in my life that I really felt was being entirely honest. Not that they were being intentionally dishonest, but none of it seemed very believable to me. I was just like, you would kind of get bits and pieces, and they'd be like, "Oh, but the Old Testament," and they kind of skirt around that. And to me, it just go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. You can finish, man.
I would say to me, it just seems like those pillars are necessary. I think in a lot of ways. And you said you hold a lot of doubts in, and
absolutely.
To me, those doubts eventually ate away at everything. There was so many doubts that there wasn't enough left to truly be like, this is a real working worldview. It's something I can remain in. Mm-hmm. To me, every time I would have to say anything, it would have to be an asterisk next to him, which I would then explain by what I mean to that, or So
absolutely.
Talk to me about kind of your own doubts and
for sure. I mean, I totally agree with you in this notion of hell. I mean, just the idea that there is a place where God's rational creation goes forever with no way out is heinous and seems just like a logical absurdity. If God is the bedrock of all that is, and he created life out of predilective love, biased love, right? Because if you think about it, there was a time in the universe where there were no thoughts, sensations, minds, nothing, right? And then this comes rushing onto the scene, right? You have to ask yourself, how could God construct a state of affairs where this creation may go to a place where they last there forever? and there's absolutely no way out. I mean, that just, to me, seems false on the face. There's no room for moral improvement, right? Any kind of meaningful punishment would be to improve in some fashion. So if God just locks us away in this dark place forever, and we say, hey, I made a mistake, I'm a finite creature, I confused by maybe religious pluralism, I just don't know if you exist or not. I'm just confused. And he's going to say, well, your ticket's up. Have fun. I mean,
Right.
that seems heinous to me. And I think it's not, I don't think it's defensible at all. I cannot find a defense for that. How I could sit here and say, well, this is why conscious eternal torment is okay. So that's why Hart's book, appeals to me so much, because I think he just really, really elucidates this so clearly.
He says specifically, there is no finite being is capable of racking up a weight of sins that can be laid. He says, like, laid across the scale. We're thinking of a justice scale here.
Right.
Laid across the scale that would evenly distribute, like, the two scales. There's no amount of finite sin that could be, and this is, and I think that's a fantastic point. And not only that, but what you said about punishment. Punishment, there's a difference between vindictive punishment and punishment that is met out on an individual in order that they may be restored or may learn in some way.
Absolutely.
It's supposed to be, and so that's why people say it's the fires that purify. It's this purification by fire.
Like Paul says, yeah.
Right. So you have this idea that this is a place where you go almost purgatorial in sense.
Purgatorial. That's what I was going to say too. That seems like the only just form of punishment. Purgatory.
Yeah.
You learn from your mistakes. You eventually advance to a change of heart, and you grow infinitely with God. Again, the notion that you're trapped away with no escape, even if you say, I want to change. I'm changed. I missed the ticket. The fact that God will say no. And Hart also makes a really good point where he says, you will only begin to ever suffer. Because if hell is infinite, you're only beginning to suffer, right? So you could be in hell for 900 billion years, and you've only just begun. That point in the book was so powerful to me. And to really think that through, to think through the implications of that, if that's the God that constructed this cosmos, that brought us into being, how could that God be worthy of worship? How could we not question his moral character? I mean, it just is sinister to me.
Yeah, this is the same point David Bentley Hart's older brother has made as well.
Addison?
I was just listening to I was just listening to a video of him saying almost word for word the same thing. And, this is this idea that, people don't, this is why he writes, one of the best things he writes in this book is that people believe they believe in hell.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
And he says they believe in hell, but they don't actually believe it.
They don't actually believe it.
I completely agree with that. Like my parents, I adore my parents. My parents are some of the most loving people on earth. There is no way my mother believes in hell. She may believe she believes in hell, but there's not that capacity for what I think an individual, the how much just, and it's just part of this submission to God, and God is sovereign, and if he said it, that's what goes. Like, you have got to be more in touch with your own moral capacity.
Yeah.
If that does not bother you, something is wrong with you. You have deflated your own moral, capacity by such a great deal, such a great value that I don't understand how we are the same too. Like, we are both human beings talking to each other. And so that is one of the best points he made. And it's true. Like, how could this eternity of just constant pain, and like you said,
torment,
like
too. Conscious,
yes, eternal conscious torment
forever.
Yes, and like you said, it never ends.
Yeah, and Riley, the really important point is just you and I in our finite love, our finite knowledge, talking about this and showing such moral concern should really speak volumes when we're talking about a being that is beyond all measure. So there's an argument too that if hell is really eternal, how could God expunge that from his mind? Right? How could he know that his creation is in hell, that he created, his rational creation that he supposedly loves more than anything, and carry on with that? Right? I think that's a really interesting point.
That is an interesting line of thought. Yeah. I think it's the same argument that in the end, God really doesn't win. People act like this is a evangelion, right? This is the good news. And the truth is that no, God set this in motion, supposedly knowing what was going to happen. And it looks like to me that Satan or the dark forces or whatever you want to call them, he won because he took the vast majority of human beings with him on his rebellious course forever. What sort of victory is that? Like, I thought God was.
That's a great point.
Is God not the ultimate victor? Does he not have the power over his creation?
And Riley, I agree with you. God is not God at the end of the day if he cannot save all and restore this broken creation that we find ourselves in. So if there is no ultimate cosmic restoration, this rescue, this dragging towards God, then you're right. It seems as if he's been defeated.
Yes.
Yeah. I cannot map it on in any logical way to my mind. And there are many hopeful universalists. I've talked with Michael Jones a lot from Inspiring Philosophy. And although he wouldn't call himself a universalist, he says, I'm a hopeful universalist. It's probably not the case that there's an eternal hell. But just the notion that we have to say, there might be, is problematic.
I'm hopeful that God is not a moral monster.
Like, I'm hopeful
that's what I hear in my brain.
Like, I'm hopeful that he may let my aunt out of hell eventually, maybe like 1,000,000 years. She just is a wonderful person. She just isn't sure. Literally, I'm speaking about my aunt. She isn't a believer. She just says, I don't know, like, there's just so many religions. I'm just not sure. Yeah. And she's going to be put away in darkness for eternity with no escape. I mean, it simply cannot be true if there really is this infinitely loving God. It's just a logical absurdity.
I completely agree. And when you start talking about things as complex as people's IQ and their ability to understand complex thought, and not only that, but their experience. We talked earlier about experiencing hell on earth, and there are people who have experienced a type of life on this earth that I will never be able to imagine or to feel in any degree because of my own privileged life and happen to be born in the United States and born to kind parents and a kind family. And
me too.
How can you look at one of these people, these people who have just been brutalized for the course of their childhood by people that are supposed to love them, and then go into adulthood and live their life just in a dismal state. And then this person's reward after all of this, maybe they just think, maybe they're just angry at God. They're angry at this idea of God, that they've, the American God that they've grown up with, or even the European God, and they don't want anything to do with him, and they live their life in mostly misery and die. You're telling me that individual is then relegated to eternal conscious torment?
Yeah.
Like, don't waste my time.
I know. Yeah, I agree. And I certainly do not think that's the case. I hope it's not the case. Like I said, I think that Scripture is ambiguous about it, and maybe it's okay that it's ambiguous about it. If Scripture flat out said, no, you're all saved, don't worry, do whatever you want, start wars, you can rape people, you can kill people, you'll all be saved, don't worry about it. I mean, that could have awful consequences. I mean, look how monstrously evil the world is, even with the notion that there is this ultimate arbiter of the cosmos that is going to judge you for your actions in this life, and you might go to hell. Look at the evil in the world still. So maybe there's some kind of merit to that ambiguity. And Michael and I talked about this, so I mean that's the best I can really do.
Yeah, I'll push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Here from my because here I am talking about Christianity and still remain the atheist that I am. So one of the things when I wrote the review about that all shall be saved, and I try to read a lot, and I don't always get the urge to write a review about something or a piece about it, but I did when I read this because it was the most lucid. You could call it a takedown, the most lucid deconstruction of the traditional hell I had ever come across. I had never read a better atheist, agnostic, non-believer, whatever critique of hell, eternal conscious torment, than I read in Heart. And I said I'm going to have to jot down some thoughts. And one of my critiques of Heart, and upon reading him more, I could adjust this a little bit, but isn't that we would never write anything if we had to constantly adjust it to our future thoughts. But one of my critiques of him was that why is it that we have this God who is all loving And he supposedly, if we're a theist and not just a deist, we have this idea that he communicates with us, with his people. Why is it that in the Bible it is so unbelievably vague, the idea of universal salvation, that the vast majority of Christians, almost the entire majority of Christians in the West, have believed that the idea of eternal conscious torment is what the Bible teaches? If you're the most, if you're pure love, if you're the best, if you created communication, surely you could have explicitly stated these sort of things. And now I'm getting into sort of divine inspiration. And I don't think Bentley Hart, upon reading him more, probably believes in divine inspiration the same way a fundamentalist does, and the idea that what Paul wrote is literally the breath of God, the words of God. Mm-hmm. But if it was, and even if it's not that, even if it's still just, I don't know, some sort of inspired way, why is it that God would get that wrong? Like, why is it that that's not clear? So that's what I'll let you.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Now, I do want to ask real quick, get what wrong?
So why would he make it? Why would the Bible or the New Testament be so vague as to allow for this sort of grievous misinterpretation? Because his point is that Paul has been misinterpreted.
Right. That's what I was going to say as well. He does argue that these are misinterpretations. I mean, that seems to be his only argument. They're misinterpreting Scripture. But, you make a really good point there. And, it's difficult to answer. The way I kind of go about it is, the Bible was still written by human beings, right? And these are still flawed human beings. So we must not forget that, right? Now, perhaps this is the way God chose to communicate, through human beings. It's a difficult question to answer. It's something I wrestle with a lot too. Why not make it crystal clear? Why not just be completely clear about this? I do think there's some merit in religious doubt, wondering maybe it's not as clear, but it's still a good question that is worthy of concern.
Yeah, so to me, this is one of the lines of thought that was one of the lines of doubt, I guess you could say, and there were many more, but this was one of them that I couldn't reconcile in any real sense, and this is just similar to the Old Testament. Like, we have this New Testament that presents a fairly, a lot of beautiful motifs. We talked about those earlier, incarnation, dying and rising, these sort of things. But in the Old Testament, I mean, you have this capricious character who is jealous and who makes decisions, his mind can be changed, who commits genocide, who condones slavery, instructs how much to beat your individuals, when they go and take the land away from another people. He specifically says, kill all the people but keep the young women for yourself. I don't think I need to elaborate on that.
You're right.
And it's to me I get to stuff like that too, and I'm like, any type of liberal Christianity, I know that's a vague term, but any type of Christianity that's not fundamentalist or traditional, like Anglican, just like I don't. Like, again, this is supposed to be inspired. This is supposed to be this. To me, I just see it as what it is, human beings thinking about God and the evolution of that over time. I don't see any sort of God talk, you know what I mean? I don't know. So what are your kind of...
No, for sure. I think the Old Testament uses a lot of hyperbole, like, go and kill them and slaughter them all. And then if you read a few pages later in the context, it says things like, they were not all slaughtered, or... we say that we're going to kill the Pittsburgh Penguins tonight. The Flyers play the Penguins tonight. Big Flyers fan. We're not actually going to kill them. And something else I would note too is that there's a really good book by Paul Copan, Is God a Moral Monster? Have you ever heard of that? Do you have it? I don't know if you've read it.
I might. I have a book similar to that. I know that book though. Yeah, I might have it on my shelf.
He kind of defends. He unpacks Old Testament ethics and the context of that. You brought up one thing. I think it was before the women. Keep the women
condoning of slavery.
Yeah, I would. He argues about that too. That we shouldn't think of slavery as antebellum slavery in the South.
It's somewhat different.
Yeah,
it is to a degree different.
But it doesn't eliminate your point that why is this so? It just doesn't seem divinely inspired. It does seem written by primitive human beings that were maybe really angry at the world and, pissed off and resentful. I agree with that. I cannot necessarily deny that.
And I
Yeah.
don't necessarily think they were angry. I have a great appreciation for the Pentateuch and for the rest of the Old Testament, as you say, or the Jewish scriptures. These were the first people, or one of the first people at least. I mean, there obviously is some plagiarism there with some of the stories, but to really create this narrative of this idea of God and a one God that communicates with us and that wants some sort of relationship with us. And I have a great appreciation for that tradition and for not only that, but for the literature that's found within. I mean, how can you not appreciate Job or appreciate Ecclesiastes?
Oh
I
yeah,
mean, these
for
are
sure.
unbelievable works. So
I
I have a great
agree.
respect for it and I have a great admiration for what they did. To me, it loses that though when someone comes along and says, this is God's inspired word and God condoned this and God did this.
Yeah.
But then you also want to then do what most theists would do, which then say God is love, or God is it's just to me it's just I don't it spoils it then it just
Yeah.
becomes rotten.
Yeah. I mean, no, I definitely think you have a good point there. But yeah, I do have a question for you real quick. Does this affect, what do you think about theism in general? Say Christianity is just out of the picture. What do you
Sure.
think of just theism in general? Like
So
classical theism?
theism, yeah. So classical theism, and we've been talking about this before the podcast as well. I've been reading Hart's book, The Experience of God, Being Consciousness and Bliss,
Hmm.
and I'm at the being, so I'm about a third of the way through, and it's not my first encounter with
Yeah.
classical theism, but it's quite good, and I I like it, but and I really don't have a problem with that sort of God. I should specify. So deism, I don't really have a problem with deism, which is the idea that there is like some sort of, and I know if you read this book, Hart plays with those words a lot, but I have to somewhat speak in generalities here. But I don't have this problem with this idea of some sort of force that is the ground of being, or that is the uncaused cause.
Right.
I know Hart doesn't like that phrasing, or that is the infinite source of actuality that exists and
Right.
props up all things and puts actuality into all of us at all moments, at all times. I like that and I appreciate that, and I do think deductively he does a really really good job of saying this is a real possibility,
Oh yeah, for
and
sure.
I think that's great. But this is where the words come into. He uses theism for this. To me, though, theism, and I know he's going to talk about this later in the book, and I've heard him speak, online, and he talks about this, and that also be shade. But theism implies that God is talking to us in some way. God is this interactive force, right? Not a person in Hart's sense. Some people would say a person,
Yeah.
though, that
Right.
we can interact with, or like Christians would say, we can have a relationship with. He can live in our heart. If you really want to use some of the worse ways to phrase it. And that is where I just don't think I don't think that can be shown in such a way that would make any of the theistic traditions
Yeah.
believable. And to Hart,
So
that doesn't seem to be important, though. He seems to think that a good Muslim will end up in the same place as a good Christian as long as they are oriented towards
well,
God.
that's what I think too. That's what and Hart says this somewhere where, we have to remember that this is ultimately, we shouldn't look at religion as a closed system of thought. Uh, this is the collective human experience verging towards that of the infinite, right? So no, I totally agree with Hart. I don't think if you're a Muslim and you just have, again, doubts, you're consigned to an eternity in hell. I think everyone eventually will be restored and find the ultimate truth. But yeah, I mean, in terms of theism, I think Hart makes great points as well. I think his arguments are very strong. I also think you can perhaps construct like a metaphysical demonstration of God's love, right? And a lot of monotheistic religions agree with this. Right? Christianity is the only one where God reveals himself, as we're told. But just the act of creation itself, if God really is the infinite wellspring of all that is, he has always existed, why choose to add conscious creatures into the cosmos? We're merely contingent, participatory creatures. Why are we participating at all? And I think that's very interesting. That even if God hasn't revealed himself, Christianity is false. I still think we could have something to stand on that say God, God may have an interest in his creatures. The fact that we're here at all, if we can demonstrate that God indeed does exist. So like even that deistic conception of God, that would be problematic, of course, because under deism, God creates and he's like the deadbeat dad, to use Spacer's words. He just leaves. He's not here anymore. So if deism is true, then that's doesn't seem like a good God. Like, I'll create you guys, but screw you. I'm gone. I'm out of the picture.
Yeah.
But so I think there's a lot of problems with deism too. I think, I agree with Aquinas that there needs to be some kind of sustaining hierarchical, not linear, back in time, right now, hierarchical series of causation that keeps this afloat. So yeah.
Yeah. So I guess my response to that would be that when again we draw back religion to this grand picture, like Hart's picture, where if you're a good Muslim you go to heaven, or you're a good Christian you go to heaven. To me, I understand that if you just go all the way back to deism, maybe you lose the eternal living in eternal bliss or the afterlife part.
For sure.
But to me, there's not enough there for me to really care. Like, in the sense that not really. That's a bad way.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What would be enough? I always ask atheists this. What would be enough for you to say that's enough there?
Yeah, I don't mean evidence-wise right here. What I mean is that when I mean is that, okay, so let's say we all go to heaven and heaven's great, whatever it is, it's actually pretty cool. It's not just worshiping the dear leader from dawn to dusk, as Hitchens would say.
Yeah.
It's not just this celestial North Korea. Again, Hitchens. I'm pulling these from him.
Yeah.
It is actually some way, somehow, a place where we can go, and there's Christian work on this, where we still live in a real sense and we still struggle in a real sense. Because to me, I don't want to go experience eternal bliss. The only thing in my life that's ever given me anything, and maybe I say this from a position of privilege in some way, but is that I like pain and growth and music based on pain and all these things. That's all part of the human experience, and I would not give that up for utopia. Utopia,
I think.
And so, I guess when I see this grand picture and Hart kind of paints this or whatever, I'm like, okay, cool. But here's the deal. That's never where it stops. It maybe with Hart it stops, but clearly Hart is the anomaly here. For the majority of Christian history, including people he talks about like Aquinas and Augustine and these other folks, it doesn't end there. It then goes to the dogmas, and it goes to the individual specific things and the incarnation, and it actually happened, and this actually happened, and this is how you should pray, and this is how you should have sex, and in what position, and this is what you should eat. Again, a Hitchens phrase. This is what you should eat, and this is how you should live.
Right.
And it becomes dogmatic. It becomes a religion. It becomes something that I think corrupts us as human beings in a sense of where we just it loses the truth in it, the truth and the beauty. So I guess that's my thing, is to go any further than that, it doesn't seem possible to me logically. There's just not enough evidence for it. But to go that far, to me, really just doesn't. I'm like, okay, so there's a God, and no matter what religion you are, if you try to be a good person, you go to heaven. Okay, that's not.
But I think we should be careful too. I don't think disagreement entails falsity, so to speak. You know what I mean? Ultimately, human beings are interpreting these things. There's going to be profound disagreement, but I still think that, like I said before, we shouldn't look at religion as a closed system. It's the human experience verging towards that of the infinite. It's still there. It's still kind of intact. We're all orienting our will towards the same thing, so to speak. Whether we're atheist or theist, we're still seeking truth, but we can still disagree. But that would negate the potential veracity of what we're trying to discover.
Yeah.
That's,
And I like that. It's just, so I'll appeal to someone you probably know here. So Harris writes in The End of Faith, he spends a lot of time explaining why liberal religion is not much of a step up from fundamentalism, because it enables fundamentalism. And so to a degree, like, I respect Hart, I respect his beliefs. So far in the book and in reading this one, I really don't have a lot of qualms with him as a person. It's just like, okay, it seems like a pretty good way to, you're based in reason, you're thinking about these things clearly. He is clearly more in touch with his moral compass than the vast majority of theists I've read in the past, and the most people you just meet on the street, atheists,
for sure. I mean,
whatever. So but it just doesn't seem to end there. What I think Hart and I have more in common than he has with a fundamentalist Muslim or even a fundamentalist Christian.
I agree, and Hart even says that. I forget where he says it, but he says, I have more respect for certain brands of atheism than Christian fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And that's the way I feel too. I mean, ultimately, I do understand your points that there's a lot of disagreement. There's confusion about certain things. For me, I just look. First of all, I think that it's inductively stronger, as I said, that God exists. I think that God does exist. I think that's more likely than not. And then I just focus on the character of Jesus, right? Himself, his teachings. I think that's very important. So, all the other stuff, while it's important, you're right. We can run into dogmas, this profound disagreement, religious pluralism, and we should attack that. But if we argue for theism first, and then we look at the character of Jesus, I think we're in a good realm here. That's kind of my approach.
Yeah, and I luckily I think just talking to you and knowing to you, it might not. It doesn't progress to it doesn't metastasize, to use a medical term, and become this sort of cancerous, horrible, dogmatic, faith that it seems to end up in. So, to me, it's just, I just, at this point, at this kind of, it's not even, I almost can't even call it a faith anymore, because even if you don't have faith, as long as your, what do we say, will is oriented broadly towards good and towards being a decent person, you'll end up, spending less time in purgatory or get to heaven faster than a Christian who had spent their life threatening hellfire on homosexuals, maybe, or whatever, what have you. And so it just, to me, and maybe this is just because I grew up a fundamentalist, it just all falls apart without some of those, it's because if Christ didn't die and, like you said, resurrect, the faith is vain.
It's
according to Hart, it doesn't matter, because if you're a Muslim, if you're a Muslim or whatever, you're going to end up at the same place anyways if you're a good Muslim. So
that's a good
to
point.
Me, then,
So
but I mean, I'm like,
where does he say that exactly though? Do you know where? Or did he say it? I don't know the context of it.
I should be upfront. I'm not a Hart expert. I've just, I'm only halfway through that book, and I've read this one, and so. But the general sense I'm getting from him and from watching him online as well, I've spent a good few hours watching, I think, a lot of, if not most of his content that's available. And so these are ideas that I'm playing. And I'm very well could come on here and have his own opinions and what he actually thinks. And I'm sure I'm misrepresenting him in some case. But I speak of Hart and those like him who have these kind of ideas. That
that's fine. Yeah.
If you are,
I was just curious if you had the book or where he said that.
Well, he does talk about. I don't know if it's in there, but one. He does. I have heard him speak about, like, I think it is in the Experience of God, where he talks about, a good Muslim would. I can't remember exactly. I'm simultaneously reading a book that was also about Islam. At the same time,
I read a lot too. It gets confusing at times. I'm like, what am I reading today?
But let's just say, regardless of Hart, if it is the case that a good Muslim, a person or even a good atheist, I try to be a decent person. Let's just say that I end up in this. I end up where the same place that you end up, or the same place that my mom, a devout evangelical, ends up, and at the same pace. To me, then, is not Paul's statement, if Christ has not died, this is all in vain, is that not because it's actually, I guess,
yeah, that's a good point. I mean,
well, I guess
yeah.
I'm sorry, to answer my own question, I guess the Christian response would be, well, Christ did die. The Christian Universalist response would be, Christ did die, so his saving power saves you regardless of not. But to me, if it didn't happen,
right.
I don't know.
I'm
going in circles.
No, it's okay. I mean, that's a really good point. That's probably what they would say, that Christ just, is the hero, so to speak, that he set the example, to restore creation. And you can choose to follow him, and maybe you'll be in heaven while you're here on earth. You can try to avoid hell, like we talked about earlier.
Right.
It's just, to me, it's utterly irrelevant to think about the ontology of hell, what that might be like. I think we should strictly focus on the psychology of hell. But yeah, I mean, would a good Muslim end up in heaven? I mean, just asking that question makes me uncomfortable. I mean, I think, of course, again, if God exists, we are all his creation. We're all his rational creation. He wanted us to be here, to participate in the cosmos, to add, flavor and color within the cosmos. And, if heaven really does exist, we will infinitely grow. And, but again, what that will be like, I have no idea,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think ultimately purgatory is the only morally permissible state of affairs. Even annihilationism, which we haven't really touched upon yet, it's a little bit better than eternal conscious torment. Like, maybe someone becomes so depraved that eventually they just, fizzle out of existence. But even that, couldn't God still work so hard to save them? I mean, why does God create a state of affairs where rational creation fizzles out of existence? But again, if we have free will, we have an identity, we can choose that. We can choose to say, no, I want nothing to do with God. How that would look for eternity, I don't know. Maybe that would be really bad. But it's certainly better than eternal conscious torment. But ultimately, this kind of purgatory, this, as my friend David Armstrong said, cosmic rehab. Cosmic rehab.
It's good.
Is the most morally permissible and logically coherent state of affairs. So
yeah. So let's see. So I will. We talked about the new atheists a little bit. Let me bring them back up again and tell you why you're completely wrong, Eric.
Oh God!
Let me tell you. Let me give you my. Let me give you my 2 cents. And I talked to James about this recently too.
Sure.
About let me raise my shield and my sword about the new atheists.
Yeah.
Specifically Hitch. Do what you want with Dennett. I have no qualms there. Dawkins, I could live without. I like Harris.
I like Harris too. He's my favorite out of all of them. I do like him.
I really like Harris, especially what he's still doing to this day, his work, which is, he talks about religion, but it's only part of what he discusses. All this to say, my defense of new atheism lies, because Hart kind of comes gunning for them, but he also almost, attacks his own argument, because he, like you have said, he says he has almost more in common with some of these morally attuned atheists than he would in a fundamentalist Christian. But he says, hey, these people aren't attacking the God of philosophy, or they're not, they don't really address classical theism. They're just talking, they're missing the point. And I agree with that. But here's why that is not the overarching, why that's not that big of a deal. Because, as Hart would say, that is not the God that the vast majority of people, I would say, believe in. They don't believe in this sort of God of philosophy. They believe in a God just like the one that Sam and Christopher and the rest pick at. And so while I don't think they're great, arguing against classical theism, I do find their arguments against the God that I believe, I would say I believed in, and that everyone in my family believes in, and that I would say the 90% of American Christians and probably 85% of European Christians and probably everyone in sub-Saharan, in Africa, the vast majority of Christians will have this sort of idea of God, is what I'm trying to say.
No, I agree.
And so that's where I say, Hitchens was arguing about things like circumcision and about other sort of, he's not talking about God as being or whatever, but that's not, like we said earlier, like, I don't really have qualms with that. You really, what, how can you hate somebody who says, oh, really, everybody's going to go to heaven, whatever that means, and God is love?
Right.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
We can sit around the campfire. I'll get my guitar. Like we're good.
Yeah.
But that's I think what the new atheists were there for, and not only that, but just a resurgence of saying, hey, you're not going to push, you're not going to subjugate and mistreat people who are non-believers, which is still a real problem. I mean, just as Christians are persecuted around the world, in many countries, non-believers are also. I mean, you can be killed for apostasy still to this day in numerous countries.
Oh, for
And
sure.
so to me, that's why I see them as necessary. So what's kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, you're right. Our conception of God, you don't just walk up to an average person on the street and say, "Hey, do you believe in God? What do you think about it?" And they say, "Well, I'm really into Aristotelian metaphysics, and God is he's simple. He's not composite, and everything flows. He's the infinite wellspring of being." They're not
that's
saying
not what
that.
you hear.
Yeah, so I agree with that. Although I still think the new atheist, even like someone like Dawkins, if you read The God Delusion, he greatly misrepresents Aquinas. Even he devotes 2 or 3 pages to some of the most rigorous arguments ever made for God's existence and strawmans them.
Sure.
But you're right. I think they serve a purpose in terms of trying to fight against that dogmatic fundamentalism, that pernicious fundamentalism. You mentioned circumcision, this kind of primitive barbarism, and I think that should be pointed out, right? But in other areas too, there a lot of critiques I have is their onus on scientism. Like, science is the only way to truth. Dawkins will say, no, science hasn't, God cannot be answered through science. Well, he doesn't exist. He probably doesn't exist, right? And what they don't understand, Dawkins himself has to assume all kinds of philosophical presuppositions before he even begins to do science. Whether there's an external world outside of his mind, whether his cognitive faculties are functioning properly, whether truth is a real thing, logic, whether numbers exist, whether there is uniformity in nature, discoverable order in nature. So he assumes all of these things. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, he definitely assumes a sort of, I think, especially with Dawkins, there's this assumption of materialism or of naturalism, you could say.
Science is the only way. There is no other way. But what they don't understand is that the question of God's existence, is not a scientific question. No, science could not answer that. Even if we get to the very end of reality and we understand all the physical arrangements of X, Y, and Z, science cannot answer why there is anything at all. This is purely a philosophical question. And I don't think he understands that. Maybe he does. I might be missing something.
And again, like you said before, like he spends 3 pages on this, but also the book is not a book. It's not a book that the title of it, though, and this is where I push back against Hartsbill. The title isn't a philosophical deconstruction of Aquinas's 5 proofs. I mean, it's part of the book. So
it's the God Delusion.
And that doesn't mean it doesn't mean he should misrepresent.
Even though that is a strong claim to make too, that this is this is a delusion.
Well, and again, you have this idea of, and there's part of this is true, right? There are religious experiences that were delusions. I mean, it's either some of this is tradition that's just brought up, but there have been delusions that have been made in religion, and people then believe, like Muhammad, he might have been delusional.
That's true, but in terms of psychiatry, the proper definition of delusion is a persistent false belief in the face of strong contrary evidence. So, you could use delusion in different ways, but that is from what I know, the correct term. And Dawkins is basically saying that people like me, David Bentley Hart, Plantinga, we're believing in something false in the face of strong contrary evidence. And I don't see that's the case at all. I think there is a lot of evidence for theism, for Christianity, and I think there's a lot of evidence also for atheism. Even I had Joe Schmidt on my channel. He's a pretty well-known agnostic, and he says, there's good arguments for God. There's also really bad arguments. There's good evidence for God. There's also good evidence against God, right? So for Dawkins to even say that is just disingenuous. It's not. Make much sense.
Part of it's part of language.
It's part of the rhetoric as well.
It's part of the rhetoric, but it's part of the language too. When he says like believers, like you technically do fall into that category, and so does Hart. But again, like you're not the typical guy in a pew necessarily on Sunday morning who believes that the Bible condemns homosexuality, and that has his his eschatology is postmillennial or premillennial, and he is that's the sort of, I think, believer that Dawkins is gunning towards. And
Sure. Yeah.
in a way, you could argue that like you can't disprove God, you can't disprove this ground of being,
No.
but if we had the evidence, if we had a time machine and we could go back in time, let's say science figures out how to use wormholes and we can go back in time to Golgotha and we can see if the resurrection took place. If the resurrection didn't take place, we've not disproved God, but we've disproved something that is, part of this conversation,
right.
part of religion. And
Yeah.
so I think
Great point.
that is where it's almost like Hart's always saying that he kind of says that they're having a different conversation. That's true. Like, they're talking about two different things because of the depravities, you could say, of the English language, or just the fact that when you say God, you mean so many different things. It's hard to write a book where every time you say God, you say the God that is believed by fundamentalist evangelicals,
Absolutely.
all Muslims, left of center, right of center, or whatever.
Gets
and
too
so
convoluted.
that's where I kind of get. So that's my and then Dawkins, though I've never been a huge Dawkins fan. I think if you read like Hitch and Sam, they're definitely more open to this, like the numinous, especially Harris when he talks about some of the evidence for. I mean, I don't want to misrepresent him, but talks about. I know he has conversations about like being psychic. He has like interests in that,
especially
and all sorts
Waking
of fun
Up.
stuff.
His book Waking Up.
Yeah,
I mean, he seems more open to this sphere of spirituality or something,
sure,
maybe non-material. Maybe that's a little too strong. I don't know. I haven't read a lot of Harris of late. I kind of stopped.
I'm
but
not an expert in him.
you know where I'm going with this.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly. Whereas Dawkins is just this dogmatic, again, this particular onus on scientism, that science is the only way, man. Like, there's nothing else. Well, what about history? How we argue abductively about history. Did certain events happen? We don't use science for that. I mean, maybe.
Yeah, he would redefine saying like analytics. We use like analytical reasoning.
Right, analytical reasoning. Right.
That sort of things. And So and then Hitch, I would definitely say, I think he points to truth in his life and his work through all sorts of things, through friendship, he talks about life being meaningful, and he doesn't say it's meaningful because of science, but talks about the wonder and the awe of the Hubble telescope and looking through it, and friendship and literature and poetry and all these things. And it's really hard, so Dawkins, he is a little bit more like, it's harder to get to that part of him, even though it might be there.
And, two of I wrote a little note here from Hart, but this onus that religion has caused so much violence, right? But not thinking about maybe the 20th century horrors or the implications of atheism. But Hart says in Atheist Illusions, the vast majority of wars have been conducted under many gods, prophets, conquest and power, nationalism, racial identity, or the greater good. But they seem to forget about that. They just go strictly to, belief in God. This monotheism has just ruined the world. Like, they will literally say the world would be better without religion, and that is such a premature claim. I mean, just read Nietzsche. Nietzsche was really critical of Christianity, but he certainly is. He might think that with the coming of the Übermensch, but he's very concerned about this notion that God is dead. It's just not a lot of strong thinking, not a lot of sophisticated thinking on my behalf, from when I've read them.
Yeah, it certainly, I mean, when you're writing a book on why religion poisons everything, you're definitely going to highlight the bad aspects of it. And those are there to be found. I mean, and I agree with, and I know Hitch isn't always the world's most perfect historian, but, he does bring up a lot of good points, but you also can't ignore the intellectual and truly moral achievements that were made in the West, and we can't delude ourselves into thinking that all of those were made or after the Enlightenment. Excuse me. Right. There's a reason an Enlightenment happened in Christendom.
Right. Exactly.
And not elsewhere in the world. And so I try to write a middle line there. Yeah. To a degree. And try to just take things for what they are, but you're gonna. I mean, Christianity, man,
it's
gave
been
us a
so
lot.
Influential. I mean, again, Tom Holland's book, Dominion goes through all of this, what the world was like before Christianity, pre-Christian cultures. And someone who really has studied history and wants to be honest is not just going to brush Christianity away like it's just silly, gullible belief. It's not. It's not at all. It has utterly transformed the world. I mean, particularly the West. Right?
And also to consider it ridiculous before we did come up with things, before Darwin and before modern philosophy and modern science. I mean, how could anyone not be a believer? Pre even the 1800s almost. Like
no,
everyone, even if you talk to the founding fathers. I have to be careful when I say our founding fathers, because not all my guests have been Americans, but our founding fathers in this case, they were, most of them were not, many of them were deists.
They were,
because that was the most rational position to take when you don't have this sort of ideas to prop up, an atheism in a way. And to me, atheism and deism is about the same thing. Almost.
It pretty much is. But where's God under deism? Like, is he just somewhere else and he's thinking about us? He's like, man, I wonder how they're doing over there. I'm not going to visit them anymore. I'm the deadbeat dad. It's really interesting when you think about it that way,
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
But one other point I wanted. Oh, do you have something to say?
No, go right ahead.
Yeah, one other point I want to make is, just another thing with the critique of the new atheism, Dawkins' incessant obsession with William Paley, right? He talks about, this complexity and ascribes complexity to God constantly. God must be so complex, but as you probably know, under classical theism, we hold that God is simple, divine simplicity. Right. So that's just another point that I find problematic with Dawkins. I mean,
Yeah. And his line of reasoning to achieve that, is this idea that if the universe is already so exponentially complex, then the thing that must prop that up would have to be the even more complex. And in that, he almost means like mysterious or hard to understand, or and it's true in a way. It would have to be something beyond, maybe not complex, but it would have to be. He's a biologist, so he has to speak in terms of complexity. He's he's done great work in biology.
Yeah, if God's ontology is simple, he could do, he could produce complex things, but it doesn't follow that he in himself is complex, right? We typically say God is non-composite. He's not made of parts, because if God was made of parts, that would require where those parts come from, and you would just have a chain of this infinite regress of all of these parts and this complexity. So again, but that's not easy to wrap your head around. I have trouble understanding that as well.
That's also part of my qualm with some of this, is that it just becomes so abstract. And I do logically appreciate what the regression of contingencies that Hart pursues in establishing this. It's not even prime mover, and it's not even like intelligent design. Like, he rejects those like terms. It's something beyond that, and I'm poor. I won't do a great job of explaining it because I haven't spent 40 years thinking about it like he has, or if not longer. But I liked it. I mean, I thought this was fairly reasonable.
It's one of my favorite arguments for God's existence, the contingency argument. Also, the fact that consciousness is in the universe, arguments for consciousness, the intelligibility of the universe. Can we really make sense of the universe? Which it seems we can. We actually, all scientists believe that, physicists, that we actually understand the universe. So those arguments, I look to a cumulative case. You have many pieces of evidence that ultimately point, in my view, towards the position of theism.
Well, let's see. We've run about an hour and a half. I did have another question for you. One of the things I wanted to ask earlier, but maybe that could kind of wrap us up in a way.
Sure.
So a lot of people come to believe these things or have their own beliefs, but they don't start an Instagram page. They don't start writing about it. They don't start making YouTube videos about it. Not everyone's a psycho like me. And once an evangelical, apparently always an evangelical, right? I am was rejecting the idea of going to be a preacher, and then doing and living my life exactly as a preacher would live, like in front of a camera, talking to people. Right. So you can't, part of it is you can't get away from who you are. So I wanted to ask you, what has prompted you to not go on this journey, but to share this journey with other people?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, I think it's really important. I think kind of like Heidegger said, modernity is within the age of technology. They've really lost, they've lost focus on the mystery of being. Um, you walk up to the average person and ask them about these questions. Just, hey, why do you think you're here? What is your meaning in life? They seem to give pretty superficial responses. Um, so that's really what inspired me to start, making YouTube videos and being on Instagram and communicating with people daily. I mean, I get messages every day from people saying, "Hey, I read your stuff on Medium. I watched your videos on YouTube, and they're really inspiring me. I've never thought about this," and that gives me inspiration. That makes me happy, because I want us to think deeply about why we're here. Think about what it means to be a good person, how we can derive meaning from life. Even if you don't believe in God, that's okay. That's your choice, and maybe the evidence isn't enough for you. That's okay, but it's still important to think about these things, no matter what religion you're a part of. And I would say the other reason is just because I enjoy it, right? I like to write, make videos, and just really ponder the most pulsating questions of life.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, and I completely agree that I think the like the elucidation of this mystery, or pointing to the mystery, and to the things around the mystery and thinking about it, it tends to make people, religious or non-religious, it makes them humbler. It makes them more humble.
Yeah.
And it makes you more cautious in your speech and in your beliefs, and in my experience makes people less dogmatic, which tends to be the problem with not only religion but a lot of non-religious thought as well. And I think it produces better, I'd like to think, better human beings. Not that I'm saying we're better human beings than everybody else. That's not what I'm saying. But
Yeah.
the act of endeavoring after these sorts of things over a lifetime, I think, can help you be a better person.
Yeah.
It can help you to be more understanding, to be more open, and hopefully, like you said, like you don't hold on to these ideas of hell that I think are generally harmful. Like I went through all sorts of stuff as a kid. I used to lay in bed and cry because I thought certain family members weren't going to go to heaven because of the way I saw them act growing up.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember my cousin one time we were at a Bible study thing, and they like separated people by like who was going to heaven and who wasn't. They were like, you had to walk up. They put tape on the ground, and then you had to walk up to the minister leader and whisper in their ear why like you should get into heaven. And the correct answer was what the evangelical answer is, which is I've repented of my sins, been like baptized, born again, blah blah, and they'd let you in. Well, a lot of kids didn't know what to say, or they hadn't been around church long enough, and they were on the other side of that. And I remember my cousin didn't get across and was like distraught afterwards because she did not know what to say. And then to live like that and to treat kids like that, that's why I think what you're saying is absolutely true.
Yeah, thanks, man. I mean, yeah, I just think that's horrible that you had to experience that. And I think that is a form of abuse, child abuse. I don't think, again, and this is the reason why I write and why I want to put content out there. People need to start thinking rationally about these things and differently, and entertaining other avenues, just not reading the plain text. And even if it's not just reading the plain text, I think there's a lot of emotional pathologies going on here. I think some people like to be a part, kind of quoting from Hart, paraphrasing, like to be a part of this small little group where they feel morally superior, that you're not, I'm morally perfecting myself, you're just, you're no good, and if I can't get you in this life, you're going to hell. So I think there's a lot of psychology going on in this, but it's really unhelpful to tell people. Christian fundamentalist groups have visited my campus on college, calling people horrific names, telling them they're going to go to hell. And it's just not productive. People need to remember that hell and sin are connected, right? This is why I keep pressing. I hope I don't sound redundant, but it's important to understand that you can be in hell right now, right?
You can.
Or you can be in heaven right now. But oftentimes we do find ourselves in hell, through constantly sinning, missing the mark, right? I talk to people that feel a little weird about that when I say, hey, you might be sinning. They feel uncomfortable to be told that. But even if you're not a Christian, it doesn't matter. It just means you need to, hey man, you need to really look at your life and reassess it. And you might be missing the mark a little bit, man. And you might need to change some things. There's nothing wrong with that, you know. And we should be trying to, change ourselves and walk in heaven and not walk in self-imposed misery that we call hell.
Yeah, I think it's all absolutely true. Absolutely true. Well, hey, thanks so much for coming on. I knew this would be a good conversation as soon as I started reading your stuff and looking at it. And so, yeah, I really appreciate it.
Riley, thanks for having me, man. I had a great time, and I hope to be back soon. Also hope to have you on my channel as well.
Yeah. Let's pick a date. We'll book it and do it.
Sounds good. Take care, man.
Thanks, Eric. You too.